Story 1. I live in Greece, and while I was in college, I worked part-time as a tour guide at the Acropolis. I have many stories from that time, but this one is probably the most ridiculous and perhaps the saddest. Since I'm bilingual, I was often assigned to English-speaking tourist groups. Tourist groups can be challenging for guides and the sites we work at. From refusing to follow basic advice like wearing hats and applying sunscreen, I can't even count how many pale tourists I've seen suffer from sunburns, sunstroke, or heat stroke up on the Acropolis, to arriving hungover or even still intoxicated, to being overly focused on selfies and photos. There are many ways to frustrate a guide, and while we always try to remain polite, it's not always easy. I hate to generalize, but I have to admit that American tourists tend to cause more trouble than others. Not all of them, of course, but quite a few. One time, I was guiding a group of American tourists from a cruise ship, one of the most common types of groups during my time working there on a standard Acropolis tour. It was mid-July, and even though it was early morning, the heat was intense. By 11 a.m., it becomes almost unbearable for those not used to it. Some folks in the group were cranky and struggling with the heat, but I was trying to keep them engaged with my lecture, and most were polite and asking questions. So far, so good. I usually gave people a few moments at each point of interest to take photos and ask questions after I finished my explanation. During one of these breaks, a woman from the group discreetly approached me. I assumed she was going to ask for the nearest bathroom, but instead, she pointed out a man in the group, with his wife and daughter, and said she had overheard him talking about taking a souvenir. She didn't think he meant something from the gift shop. This immediately put me on high alert. Antiquity theft is a serious and long-standing issue in Greece, and no one takes it lightly. I decided to keep an eye on the man, hoping he wouldn't be foolish enough to follow through on his idea. Things were quiet for the next few stops, until we reached a location near the Parthenon, where I usually explained the restoration process and ongoing preservation efforts. This area was right next to an active restoration site, where many stone pieces were lying around, waiting to be processed or placed back on the monument. Some of the stones were quite large, but others were small chunks of marble, some with carvings. It was a mix of original Parthenon pieces and new stone meant to replace damaged sections. After my explanation, I allowed the group to ask questions and take photos. While answering a young boy's question, I noticed out of the corner of my eye that the man from earlier bent down as if to tie his shoelace and discreetly scooped up a piece of marble, shoving it into his cargo pants pocket, thinking no one would notice. I immediately approached him, and, to the best of my memory, this is how the conversation went. Me: "Excuse me, sir? Please return the stone you just took to where you found it. This is an active archaeological and restoration site, and no artifacts are to be removed." Tourist: "I'm not sure what you're talking about." Me: "Sir, you understand perfectly. I'm a native English speaker. You picked up a stone from the restoration area, and you need to put it back immediately." Tourist: "I didn't take anything." Me: "Sir, I saw you take a piece of marble and put it in your pocket. Please return it. Otherwise, this is considered antiquity theft and vandalism of an archaeological site, and I will be forced to call security, who will then contact the police." At this point, the woman who had initially alerted me spoke up, confirming that she had also seen him take the marble and kindly suggested he just put it back. Meanwhile, the man's wife stood there looking impatient, waiting for the group to move on. Their teenage son, around 17, had his phone out and looked like he wanted no part of the situation. Tourist: "Oh my goodness, are you seriously making a big deal over a little piece of stone? No one's going to miss it. I bet people take things from here all the time. It's like the Berlin Wall." By this point, I was pretty angry. I wanted to snap at him, pointing out that maybe he didn't understand the cultural and emotional significance of the Acropolis because he came from a place where something 100 years old is considered ancient. But I knew that wouldn't be fair to the rest of the group, who looked embarrassed and were trying to stay out of it. Me: "Sir, this site is of priceless historical, cultural, and archaeological value. Every piece of it is an artifact. This is also an active restoration site, and the stone you took is part of what remains of a building that has already suffered enough damage and looting. Please put it back, or I will have to inform security." At this point, I had already taken out my phone to call my supervisor. Story 2. I wasn't the victim in this encounter with a Karen, but I did get the chance to enact some petty revenge. Amidst the pandemic, many businesses were limiting the number of customers allowed inside at once. I headed to the grocery store across the street and saw the massive line. While there were only about 50 people in line, social distancing made it stretch out pretty far. Since I needed groceries and the weather was nice, I decided to wait and take this opportunity to relax. In front of me was Karen, talking on the phone and complaining about the long line and how she was in a big hurry. She was decked out in full pandemic gear: mask, gloves, goggles, a hairnet, no clue what that was for, and a custom shirt that said, "Stop, stay 6 feet away from me." Anytime someone walked by on the sidewalk, she would dodge them to keep her distance. After about 10 minutes, the line moved, and there were only 30 people in front of us when a woman about 4 places ahead of Karen sneezed into her sleeve. Now, let me clarify that sneezing is not a symptom of the virus, nor does it indicate someone's health status. It was April, the peak of allergy season, and as someone who has suffered from allergies my whole life, I can tell the difference between a sick sneeze and an allergy sneeze. This was definitely an allergy sneeze. But Karen, she acted like she'd just uncovered a bioterrorism plot. She started yelling at the poor woman, even though they were still 30 feet 9 meters apart. Karen was literally shouting, giving a lecture on how the woman was endangering the community and her children by being out when she, obviously, had the virus. Naturally, Karen called over the employee monitoring the door, who then sent out the manager as expected, because we all know Karen was going to call for the manager eventually. The manager tried to assess the situation while Karen threatened to call the police to have the woman arrested. The woman, clearly fed up, just gave up and left, likely planning to either return later or go to another store. Karen, satisfied, stayed in line. I was convinced she was just looking for a reason to kick someone out and shorten her wait. Now, as someone who works in the field of disease research, I've seen how irrational people can be about this pandemic. Karen's behavior, nearly starting a panic, just couldn't go unpunished. The temperature was around 88 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius, which wasn't particularly hot, but given it was the first day to break past 65 F, it felt warmer than usual. People in line were visibly sweating after standing in the sun for so long, and Karen was no exception. She was fanning herself when she finally made it to the front of the line. That's when I saw my opportunity. Just before the door clerk gave her the go-ahead to enter, I innocently asked, "Ma'am, are you feeling all right? You look a bit warm, kind of feverish." She snapped back, "I'm fine, it's just the sun. Mind your business." But the door clerk caught on and agreed, saying, "Miss, we'll have to take your temperature." He radioed the monitors. The store had a thermal gun to check temperatures of anyone who looked suspicious. I'd never seen it used, but I knew they had it. Karen protested, "Why? It's just because I've been in the sun. You didn't check anyone else's temperature," the clerk calmly explained. "It's just store policy to check anyone who appears feverish." The staff member came over and took her temperature: 100.7 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius, just over the store's 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit limit. He informed Karen that she wouldn't be allowed to enter for public safety. That's when she had a full-blown meltdown, insisting, "It's the sun. I'm not sick. Test him," she said, pointing at me. So they did. My temperature, a cool 99.9 degrees Fahrenheit. The clerk smiled and said, "You're good to go." I thanked him and walked inside to grab my groceries while Karen continued her tirade outside. I hope she eventually found her essential items, perhaps that Pinot Grigio she seemed desperate for, just not from that store. Side note, many grocery stores offer early shopping hours for seniors to reduce their risk of infection. I almost suggested Karen try that, but since she couldn't have been older than 45, I figured it would only make her more upset. Story 3. Back in the 1980s, I was a couple of years out of college when I moved into an apartment near the shore in New Jersey. When cold weather hit, there were always a few days when the apartment was chilly, but after reporting it to the superintendent, the heat would come on. However, one year in February, the heat began to diminish significantly. The inside temperature dropped to around 50 F, and we had to start wearing coats inside. We reported it to the super, but this time, nothing happened. We even wrote to the landlord, but again, no response. After consulting with an attorney, we learned about the warranty of habitability and the process of withholding rent. We sent another certified letter to the landlord and began withholding rent. The landlord responded by filing for eviction, and we countered with a Marini defense, depositing the withheld rent money with the court. The judge ruled in our favor, allowing us to withhold the rent we had retained. We continued to live there because affordable housing options were limited as we saved up for a home. Fast forward 6 years, and during our final lease, as we were preparing to buy a house, we added a clause to the lease that allowed us to break it with 45 days written notice, similar to the landlord's 45-day clause. The landlord didn't notice the clause because it was slightly obscured on page 2, so they signed off on it and returned the lease to us. In the middle of the lease, we gave the required 45-day written notice, made our rent payments, and moved out. However, they didn't return our security deposit. We sued for the deposit, demanding double the amount, while they sued us for the remaining 6 months of rent and continued to withhold our security deposit. This escalated beyond small claims court, but we proceeded without an attorney to avoid legal fees. At the courthouse, we were forced into arbitration. The arbitrator advised that we would likely lose and should pay the remaining rent. We refused and waited for the judge. While waiting, the landlord's attorney approached us, asking why we hadn't accepted the arbitrator's advice. We explained that we had included a clause in the lease allowing us to break it. The attorney claimed he had seen it, but said it had been crossed out, and thus wasn't part of the deal. We then showed him our copy of the lease where the clause was not crossed out. His face turned pale as he realized the mistake. He immediately called the landlord, who then offered to break the lease without penalty and return our full security deposit. We declined, showing him a certified letter where we had offered to accept that deal up until the day before. Since they forced us to come to court, we now demanded double damages for the improper withholding of the deposit. The attorney tried to contact the landlord again, but it was too late. We went before the judge, who reviewed both copies of the lease. The judge handed our lease to the attorney and firmly stated, "This is the lease in force." The attorney paced the courtroom in panic, while I quietly tried not to laugh. The judge ruled in our favor, awarding us double damages. For about a week, we received no payment, so I went back to the courthouse, where the clerk informed me that the judgment should be paid immediately. She told us about chattel execution, a process where the sheriff can seize property to satisfy a judgment, and gave us the necessary form. A couple of weeks later, we received a check from the landlord. Another month passed, and we received a call from the court. The court informed us they had additional money for us. I explained that we had already received payment from the landlord, and the court clerk revealed that they had sent the sheriff to the landlord's office to confiscate equipment and sell it at auction to satisfy the judgment. Since we had already been paid, the court planned to return the money to the landlord. In the end, not only did we get the money we were owed, but the landlord also had the unpleasant experience of having their office equipment seized and sold at auction, only to have the proceeds returned to them. Justice served with a side of poetic irony. Story 4. 2 years ago, I met a man at a bar. He approached me, and we started chatting. He was very charming, intelligent, and charismatic. We exchanged numbers and began dating. He was attentive and sweet, single, never married, and had no children. He seemed like Prince Charming. I was a bit naive and didn't have much relationship experience. We saw each other regularly, and he stayed in constant contact through phone and text. We exchanged hundreds of messages daily when we weren't together. 6 weeks into the relationship, He started complaining about his living situation, saying how terrible his housemates were and how he wanted to move out. I live in a large home by myself, and he subtly hinted at moving in with me. It felt too fast, so I didn't offer. He never brought it up again, and we continued seeing each other, talking about the future, marriage, holidays, and kids. He had told me earlier about his supposed wealth, how he owned multiple homes and businesses worldwide. So it surprised me when, 8 months into the relationship, he asked me for money to help fund a new business venture. I declined, as I had started noticing little lies and inconsistencies in his stories and behavior. He was also becoming controlling and often made negative comments toward me. I began to distance myself as things weren't adding up. He reassured me that everything he had told me was true, insisting he loved me and would never hurt me. But something still felt off. I started doing my own research, trying to find information about him online, but nothing came up. I eventually ended the relationship, though he begged me to take him back. I was skeptical but continued talking to him, curious about who this man really was. Unable to shake my gut feeling, I hired a private investigator to get to the bottom of things. What I found out was devastating. It turned out he had been married for 10 years and lived with his wife and 2 children. He had actually been married 3 times and had 5 kids in total. He was broke, despite his claims of wealth. He had lied about his age, his upbringing, and nearly every detail of his life. On top of that, he had a serious mental health disorder, was a pathological liar, and a manipulator. I had started realizing this by the end. He was secretly involved with men, had a harem of women, and ran love fraud schemes for attention, money, and personal gain. He had even conned friends out of money. The list of his deceptions seemed endless. When I confronted him with the truth, he lied again, insisting it wasn't true. I was furious and told him to leave me alone. Incredibly, he tried one last time to con me out of money. Revenge, I decided to expose him on social media, creating an anonymous account to warn future victims. I posted screenshots of the detailed report from the private investigator. It gained a huge amount of attention and went viral. It turned out this man had wronged far more people than I had initially thought, and many were seeking justice. I moved out of the state where this happened 3 months ago and have been trying to move on with my life. Always trust your gut instincts. Story 5. Not long after I started working at the store, I was called into a meeting with the store manager regarding a situation with a coworker. The meeting interrupted my lunch break, so after it was over, I was informed that I could restart my lunch because I was entitled to a full, uninterrupted hour. Since they interrupted me, I got to start over, and they adjusted my time accordingly. I stored this information in my head for future reference, and it eventually came in handy. Fast forward, I was working in the connection center, which handled prepaid and contract cell phones. In our store, the connection center was part of the electronics department, along with the photo center. At that time, we in the photo center were considered a special division separate from the main store, with our own payroll and managers. Technically, we were supposed to help cover each other's areas, and we couldn't be pulled into other departments. Likewise, other departments weren't supposed to help us. However, in practice, the electronics staff would often help our customers if we weren't there, and we would help them when we could. The exception was contract cell phones, which only we could handle, as they required credit checks and processes like those in a traditional phone store. One day, for reasons I can't recall, I was working alone for my entire shift. Typically, there would be 2 of us, one working 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. and another from 12 p.m. to 9 p.m. However, the morning person either called out or left early, leaving me by myself. Around 3:30 p.m., half an hour before my scheduled lunch break, 2 customers approached, interested in getting a contract phone. I was finishing up with another customer, so I told them I'd be done in about 15 minutes. They left, and I finished my transaction. However, I didn't see them return. I waited briefly, then handled a few more customers, so by the time I finally went on lunch, it was after 5 p.m. Around 5:30, I was close to getting locked out of the system, so I decided to take my lunch break. The person in electronics that day was one of the few who didn't like our department and refused to help our customers. I informed him that I was going on lunch and to send any of our customers to the photo center if they needed help. About 30 minutes into my lunch, I heard an announcement over the intercom calling for assistance in the connection center. Since I was in the break room, I called up to electronics and reminded them I was on lunch. I asked them to send the customer to the photo center or let them know I'd be back in 30 minutes. It turned out the customer just had a question about a prepaid phone card. 10 minutes later, I was paged again, but this time I ignored it. They knew I was on lunch. A few minutes later, I was paged once more. By this point, I had about 15 minutes left of my break when one of the store managers came into the break room. He asked why I wasn't answering the pages, assuming I was on my last break since it was after 6 p.m. He didn't realize I was still on lunch. He seemed to think I was just avoiding helping the customer. I tried to explain that I had 15 minutes left on my lunch, but he interrupted me and told me to help the customer and take my break later. I tried again, explaining that I was off the clock and would help after lunch, but again, he cut me off, saying, "You can restart your time after you help them." A light bulb went off in my head. I asked, "You want me to help the customer now and then restart my time?" He rolled his eyes and said, "I don't care, just go help them and restart your time afterward." So I agreed, packed up my things, clocked back in, and headed to the department. When I arrived, I found the same customer who had come in earlier, finally returning. He wanted to get a phone, so I asked for his ID and explained that I'd need to run a credit check, and he might have to pay a deposit depending on the results. As soon as he heard the word credit check, he lost interest. He admitted his credit was bad and said a phone store had already asked for a large deposit, but he thought things might be different at our store. The interaction took about 5 minutes. Afterward, I helped another customer with a prepaid phone before turning to electronics and announcing, "I'm going to restart my lunch now. I'll be back in an hour." The electronics associate's jaw dropped. He started protesting, claiming I had already taken my lunch. I calmly explained that management had interrupted my break, so I was entitled to restart it. I returned to the break room, where I had about another half hour left. Around 30 minutes later, the same manager from earlier walked in. Thinking I had just started my break, he made a comment about it. I clarified that I was retaking my lunch and had another 30 minutes to go. He paused, confused, and asked what I meant. I explained that when he interrupted my lunch to help the customer, I had to restart my break afterward. Realizing his mistake, he asked why I hadn't told him I was on lunch. I reminded him that I had tried, but he kept cutting me off. His face turned bright red, and he muttered that this wasn't what he meant. He said he would talk to my manager tomorrow. The next day, I was questioned about the situation, but I had already messaged my manager, explaining everything and ensuring I was covered for time theft concerns. The photo center employees backed up my story, confirming that electronics never told them a customer needed help. The manager had to admit that he had told me to help the customer without checking whether I was on the clock. The assistant manager tried to downplay it, suggesting I was being dramatic and should have just gone when paged. I countered by asking what would have happened if I had left the store for lunch, as I usually did. They agreed I was in the right. I made it clear that had they communicated the situation properly and called me to let me know someone needed help with a contract phone, I would have likely clocked in early and assisted, as I had done before. But since the initial customer inquiry was something electronics or photo could have handled, I wasn't going to interrupt my lunch multiple times. In the end, the electronics employee never paged me like that again. A few other employees even learned about the lunch rule that day, and I got paid to read for an extra hour. Story 6. Every year, a few friends and I rent a beach house for a week of relaxation, fun, and parties. Last year, my girlfriend and I decided to spend the final night there camping in the backyard, just for the fun of it. As usual, my friend Sweetness ended up getting teased for drinking too much and becoming rowdy. My buddy Sean had an absurd number of zip ties in his car, far more than any normal person would own. When Sweetness got loud and out of control, Sean and a few of our friends who rented the house grabbed Sweetness and hogtied him using the zip ties. I'd give more details about what happened next, but I don't want this post removed. Let's just say, remember the zip ties. After a long night of drinking and other activities, my girlfriend and I retired to our tent and fell asleep. Suddenly, we were jolted awake by loud explosions. Boom, bang, pop. Roman candles were hitting our tent. Apparently, my friends thought it would be hilarious to fire them at our sleeping bag. Silly me for thinking we'd get a normal night's sleep. After 10 straight minutes of being bombarded like fugitives in hiding, I unzipped the tent to find the front singed and my friends giggling like mischievous kids. My girlfriend was frightened, and I was furious. They eventually went back inside, but I was too mad to sleep and too tired to make a scene, so I stayed awake and plotted. As time passed, I found myself in Sean's car, borrowing some of his zip ties. I tiptoed inside the beach house and got to work, zip tying everything in sight. I tied the rolls of paper towels together, glassware, cutlery, and even the TV remote to the fire detector. I zip-tied the oven and microwave doors shut and secured the pots and pans to the hooks they hung on, making them impossible to remove. As I passed by Sweetness, still sleeping and hogtied, I decided to zip-tie his phone to the door handle because why not? I wasn't even worried about waking anyone up at this point, but lucky for me, they were so exhausted that not even a fire would have stirred them. I got creative with my zip ties, securing the toilet lid down, tying people's shoes together, and even connecting random cords and kitchen items. I zip-tied cartons of eggs, individual hot dog buns, hamburger rolls, and beer cans so that you couldn't lift the tab. For a final touch, I zip-tied the pack of zip ties I had been using. By the time I was done, it looked like the SWAT team had come through and arrested everything in the house. The next morning, my girlfriend and I left extra early. Later that day, I received several texts from my friends. Some were in good spirits, while others were less amused, especially since no one could open the toilet when they needed it most. One friend was so desperate that he ended up using the trash can, the one thing I couldn't zip tie well enough. They had to make a trip to the nearest hardware store to buy razors and cut the zip ties before the landlord returned. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I hid the knives and scissors in the backyard. Story 7. The Awakening. This year, I finally realized why credit is so important. I had no idea what to expect when I downloaded my credit report, thinking I'd only see a student loan and 2 credit cards in my name. What I discovered next shattered my heart. To my shock, there were 6 open credit cards. What? How could this be? Where did these extra 4 cards come from? Why are they still open with outstanding balances? Why have 2 been closed by the creditors? Why is my credit so low? After a moment of panic, my mind wandered to a place I hoped it would never go. My mother. The betrayal begins. 6 years ago, my mother first stole my identity by opening a credit card in my name using my social security number. Since then, she had opened 3 more credit cards, maxed them out, missed payments, and had accounts closed, all while I remained unaware. How could my mother do this to me? I felt sick. I felt hurt. I felt confused. I felt angry. I felt overwhelmed. I felt disgusted. All I ever did was try to help you. I immediately called my mother. I was furious, but she hung up on me. So, I called my stepdad to vent, but to my disbelief, he defended her actions. He claimed, "She was only trying to build your credit." At that moment, I was flooded with emotions: anger, hurt, confusion, frustration, all intensified by his defense of her betrayal. I knew my mother had financial struggles in the past. Her house went into foreclosure, and she had to file for bankruptcy. At one point, my stepdad worked 3 jobs to support us while she was jobless. Even when married to my dad, her first husband, she didn't work. He missed birthdays and important events, slaving away at his restaurant to provide for us. Did she ever feel any remorse? What she did was illegal. She could go to jail. I could press charges and burden her life the way she burdened mine. True colors. My mother's perfect life on social media was a facade. She wasn't rich. Her family wasn't perfect, and neither was her relationship. She wasn't even pleasant to be around. When confronted, she exhibited what seemed like a split personality, alternating between trying to guilt me and cursing me out. Here's an example of a text exchange where she kept speaking without me responding. Notice the drastic mood swings. Uncalled for accusations. We will pay the credit cards off as soon as possible. I never intended to put you out but create credit for you. You are out of control. You can expect your credit to go up by 30 points when paid off. I never took a penny from you. All I ever did was try to help you. I am done. I am over trying to help you. I did everything I could for you. I would never let you fall. WTF is this my daughter thanking me? Oh, I am so disappointed in you and your reaction. My intentions are to pay it off and let you be on your own. You are out of control. A week later, I reminded her that the debts still needed to be paid. Our conversation ended with her saying, "Bye. Been paid. Bye. Forget you, which. Me. Own up to what you have done. Mom, I'm sorry for giving you credit." The next day, she claimed to have paid off and closed all the cards. I asked for proof, a screenshot, an email, anything. I have yet to hear back from her. So, what now? It has been 3 weeks since this incident. At first, I spent many sleepless nights wondering what I did to deserve this betrayal. I couldn't understand how my mother could hurt me so deeply and refuse to apologize. Nor could I understand how my stepdad, who had been in my life for nearly 20 years, was so quick to defend her and cut me out. Over time, I realized I didn't need to keep toxic people in my life. I've leaned on my friends, colleagues, boyfriend, and other family members for support. I came to understand that in order to move on, I needed to forgive not for them, but for myself. They will have to live with what they did for the rest of their lives, while I can find peace in my heart. Fools take a knife and stab people in the back. The wise take a knife, cut the cord, and free themselves from the fools. Recap. Here's a brief recap. My mother illegally opened 4 credit cards in my name when I turned 18. Now, at 24, I've discovered this and demanded that the cards be paid off and closed. My mother somehow convinced herself that she was helping me build credit, not harming me. She claimed I owed her for everything she did as a parent. She's deluded herself into thinking she did me a favor by maxing out credit cards in my name. Despite all this, since she closed 3 of the 4 cards, my credit score has increased by nearly 80 points. Our relationship now. Honestly, I feel like our relationship is ruined. I still feel disgusted and hurt by what she did, and we haven't spoken since. She refuses to apologize because she believes I owe her for parenting me. I haven't spoken to my stepdad either, who quickly jumped to her defense. I don't think things will change unless we go through serious counseling and rebuild trust, but I'm not holding my breath. Moving forward, life goes on. I've continued working, remodeling my classroom, and focusing on improving myself. I've also come to the conclusion that in order to move forward, I must forgive. But not for her. She doesn't deserve to know my feelings on this. I need to forgive for myself so I can find peace. Cutting her off was necessary because she's toxic, and family or not. Sometimes you have to choose your own well-being over maintaining a relationship with someone who has hurt you deeply. Family or not, there comes a time when it's essential to prioritize your peace, even if that means cutting off your own mother. Story 8. Back in 2020, I was living on the Oregon coast, specifically in Lincoln City. In September of that year, wildfires spread uncontrollably throughout the region. It was an especially hot month, and the fires made everything worse. The flames grew so close that the smoke covered the sky, leaving it with a dim orange glow. It was hot, dark, and incredibly uncomfortable. We lost power for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably around 3 weeks. Honestly, the whole experience was so traumatic that none of us remember it the same way. We had to use a cooler to keep perishables from spoiling, and did everything with practically no visibility because the smoke blocked out the sun. It was like living in darkness for weeks. Needless to say, it was a terrible experience. Eventually, we reached the point where we had to actively evacuate, unsure if we'd ever see our home again. Our group had to split into 2 cars, and I ended up taking one of our 3 dogs, a nervous little thing who always got carsick. The chaotic fire situation certainly didn't help her, and she started vomiting over and over. Just when I thought she couldn't possibly have anything left in her stomach, I felt another warm glob on my jacket. Since I figured I was likely going to lose everything back home anyway, I decided to cut my losses. I rolled down the window and tossed the jacket out of the car, knowing there was no way to save it. Here's where things got petty, though I don't think I** was the petty one. Amidst the chaos of evacuating from a town ravaged by wildfires, a random man saw me toss out my jacket and had the nerve to yell at me for littering. As if the fire wouldn't literally burn it up in an hour. Of all the moments to choose to be a stickler for rules, this guy picked now. I couldn't believe it. But here's the best part, jokes on him. As he bent down to pick up the jacket and tried to hand it back to me, his face twisted in disgust, and I heard an audible "ugh" come from him. My friends and I couldn't help but laugh as we drove away. It turned into the much-needed comedic relief of the entire nightmare situation. In case you're wondering, our home did end up surviving the fire. But when we finally returned after weeks of darkness and an abrupt evacuation, the place looked like something out of Asterisk, the Walking Dead cards still on the table, everything frozen in time, but untouched. There are many things I'll never forget about that time, but the memory of Puke Jacket Guy holds a special place in my mind.